comes on in an instant. This ominous quivering beneath the skin. Heart beating and pounding within the rib cage. Hands start to get tacky and sweaty, and your mouth is paradoxically dry and yet full of saliva. Stomach sinks. In collusion with these vicious sensory experiences comes a full-on internal monologue that is inaudible to everyone, yet simultaneously deafening to you. You're going to fuck this up. This is going to be a complete disaster. You're not cut out for this. Your breath starts quickening to short, sharp inhales that barely service the lungs. A lump rises in the throat, and then the band starts. It's the jaunty, upbeat intro to Whitney Houston's I Want to Dance with Somebody. And the punters come running onto the dance floor, gazed up at you, they're ready to be ushered into a super good time. And the band look over too. The stage lights are hot and the fallback speakers are loud and crackly. It's time to sing. This was what was going on in the few seconds that preceded one of the worst moments of my entire life. Although, just by looking at me, you would never have known. You see, as a professional vocalist, someone who'd been singing and performing live for almost 1/3 of my life, this should have been just another gig. You know, another run-of-the-mill covers function, been there, done that a million times. Only what was going on beneath my skin, inside my body, and inside my mind was this loud, disorienting cacophony. I knew something was wrong, but I was scared. I was embarrassed and I was ashamed. Come on, get on with it. What the hell is wrong with you? This is going to be an absolute disaster. You're going to make a bloody fool of yourself. When I did open my mouth to sing eventually, something came out, but it was barely passable for a melody. My voice faltered on each passing interval, increasing those sensations within my body and the chatter within my mind until I could barely stand up straight. When this shambles of a gig was over, and what seemed like in very quick succession, I lost all of my gigs, lost what felt like was all of my friends. I couldn't pay my rent, and I moved home with my parents. I wouldn't have known it then, but that ominous moment up on that stage, bumbling from note to note, and everything that happened after would completely transform my life and take me to places that I would never have imagined I would have gone. You see, I always thought that I had quite an in-depth relationship with myself and who I was meant to be, and what I wanted to do with my life. I knew that I wanted to perform. I knew that I wanted to be on stage and sing. It was who I was. Yet when this happened to me, which was around 6.5 years ago now, I was suddenly tugged into a world of uncertainty, of confusion, of isolation, and I didn't know who I was anymore. So I decided to start from scratch and go on a little bit of an exploration. What did it mean to be me when all of the dreams and hopes and the things that I thought made me me were no longer viable? So I was always a very sensitive kid. Growing up, I took everything very personally and had lots of big emotions. But I think the time that I realized that my emotional world was a complete roller coaster was through my adolescence. And, you know, that's not uncommon. The teenage years are particularly tumultuous for many of us. But for me, I imagined myself to be this very complicated young teenage girl. Now, if you had laid eyes on this, 16-year-old white middle-class girl with a really great friendship group, going to a well-performing selective school, and a fantastic, loving, and supportive family, I would forgive you for not instantly going, ooh, deep, complex, tortured. However, this is exactly how I felt at that time, and looking at these photos almost takes me back. This was me in the middle here at a raging party where I decided I was going to read Pride and Prejudice and not talk to anyone. So I had all of these big feelings and I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know how to manage them, and I also just didn't feel like other people were going through these emotional storms quite the same way as me. So I went on a hunt and I tried to find someone that could understand me, or some people who sounded like they had similar experiences in life. And of course, I found them in the arts. I found them in music. I found them writing novels and poetry. I found them painting pictures and making movies. And these people seemed like they had all the answers that I was seeking. Finally, if I was there engulfed in emotion, that didn't mean that I was broken. It meant that I could be a great artist. It meant that I was rich and deep and complicated. But the only thing that comes with getting, your life directions and messages and guidance from people in the arts is that you can also start to pick up some other kind of damaging ideals about what it means to be creative, what it means to be an artist. And one of the things that I picked up, in all of these rock and roll biographies and existential literature was that emotions are deep, but only some kind of emotions, right? If you want to be deep and complex and make great art, you need to suffer. You need to hurt. You need to put your pain and suffering and sadness and isolation up on a pedestal for all to see. And if you're curious about how I would have gotten that idea, I guess I don't know where it could have possibly come from. So these were my best friends in high school, and plenty more to go with them too. And so suddenly I did feel less alone. However, I started to develop this notion that happy people were boring people. Happy people weren't complicated. They didn't make great art. And it kind of pulls me to this amazing quote by an Ursula Le Guin, a short story by her. It says, "The trouble is that we have a bad habit of considering happiness as something rather stupid. Only pain is intellectual, only evil interesting. This is the treason of the artist, a refusal to admit the banality of evil and the terrible boredom of pain. If you can't lick 'em, join 'em. If it hurts, repeat it. But to praise despair is to condemn delight." If you had shown me this quote in my teenage years, I would have thought, oh, it's because you're one of those boring, happy people. And I would have completely written you off. So this was the ideology that fired me up in my teenage years, and I carried it very closely all throughout my 20s. I was still feeling these huge emotions that I didn't know how to reckon with. And particularly those of suffering, those of sadness, isolation, and fear, I really went to town on them. When they came up for me, I would think, I would stew, I would ruminate everything I could to make those emotions bigger and bigger and bigger. I figured that this was the path to being an incredible artist. I figured this was the path to making huge impact and creating wonderful works of art that would reach out and connect with people. But I have to tell you that it didn't really contribute to me making much of an artistic dent at all. Throughout my 20s, I was overburdened with feelings of imposter syndrome and shame. Nothing that I did was good enough, and whenever I thought that I could maybe make something, I would look at it and go, that looks crap. I can never show that to anyone. And, oh, this is way too hard for me to do. It must mean that I'm not a real artist. time and time again, these thoughts would come up. I would get a sinking feeling in my stomach whenever it came to potentially doing anything brave or courageous or putting my art out there. So I stayed very, very small. I flitted through a range of creative industries, kicking off in film and television, and then I worked in radio, I worked in visual arts, and then I eventually landed working in music. My whole family was incredibly musical, and I had grown up performing in professional music theatre as a teenager. So it was kind of already my wheelhouse, and I was pretty comfortable there. So I spent a few years in the music scene, but I was never brave enough to release my own music. In fact, the EP that I finally wanted to put out in the world was released 3 weeks before this gig that I told you about in the intro. So pretty shitty timing. But, you know, living at home with my parents and not having a job offered plenty of time to think. My parents thought too much time to think, you've got to get your ass up and get a bloody job. So I did. I got a job at a bookstore. And in the bookstore, I found myself drifting towards the psychology section. And one by one, I used my great staff discount to purchase my way through the entire section. In there, I seemed to find those answers that resonated with me, similar to those rock and roll biographies and existential literature of my teenage years. Only this time, these scientists and researchers and psychologists were telling very different stories. And they were exploring very different ideas, things to do with creativity and emotions, things to do with behaviors and patterns, things to do with our thoughts and the world inside of us. Suddenly, I began to discover that my emotional condition was not all that uncommon. And I fell upon this particular book by a psychologist called Elaine Aron. And at the start of the book, she calls you to complete an assessment. And I'm going to ask if you guys have your fingers out on you, pop a finger up for every one of these that you would answer, yes, that's me, most of the time, more often than not. You are often extremely aware of subtleties in your environment, things like sounds, sights, smells, details. You can become easily overwhelmed by things like bright lights, strong smells, coarse fabrics, or sirens close by. You have a rich, complex inner life. You get rattled when you have a lot to do in a short amount of time. You find yourself deeply moved by the arts or music. You become annoyed when people try to get you to do too many things at once. You are bothered by intense stimuli like loud noises or chaotic scenes. You find it unpleasant to have a lot going on at once. You are shaken up by changes in your life. You notice and enjoy delicate or fine scents, tastes, sounds, works of art. So this questionnaire is just a shortened version of the full one. But when I discovered this book and I did this assessment, I realized that I scored off the charts. And apparently, according to Elaine Aron, this would classify me in a group of people that she calls HSPs, or highly sensitive people. Now, highly sensitive people are not that uncommon. They are assumed to make up roughly 15 to 20% of the population. And as what wouldn't probably surprise you, a lot of artists and creatives identify themselves as highly sensitive as well. So the colloquial term that we use is orchids, where some people might be known as dandelions, people who are quite robust and resilient and can thrive in a range of different environments and situations. There are some of us who require a little bit more delicacy and maybe some more specific types of care and cultivation to get us to thrive. So suddenly I could make sense of myself in a way that didn't make me feel like I was broken or chaotic I was able to create some order. And being able to identify as an HSP gave me permission to explore my emotions and my emotional world in a little bit of a newer way. So I realized that my connection to my emotions and my connection to myself more broadly was something that I needed to revisit. Of course, I always thought that I was deeply connected to who I was and what I was feeling. Wasn't that the problem? The interesting thing that I started learning when I started reading the psychology literature was that our emotions don't come delivered in these tidy, neat little packages. They don't come served as, ooh, this is sadness, ooh, this is fear, ooh, this is joy. And it's kind of how we talk about them and how we are led to understand them through our youth and growing up in the world. In fact, emotions are a lot more messy and complicated. And emotions have so much more to do with our understanding and relationship of the emotions that we're experiencing, the relationships and systems that we're enmeshed in, the type of work we do, the type of lives that we live, the type of people who surround us, and the cultures that we're a part of. So suddenly I was realizing that you could feel happy and sad at the same time, that there wasn't any particular need to idolize certain feelings like misery and sadness and isolation. I mean, they hadn't really been doing much for me thus far, right? So there is an incredible psychologist called Lisa Feldman Barrett, and her research is in the field of emotions. She has a theory called the theory of constructed emotion, where she talks about the fact that our emotions are not blueprints within our brains and bodies. There's not one way that you can express fear. There's not one way that you can experience sadness and joy. And your sadness and joy might not look or feel like somebody else's. There's an incredible power to understanding our own unique emotional experiences and giving a label to them, in expanding our emotional vocabulary and realizing that things like fear, things that we think we don't want to feel, are sometimes emotional experiences that we crave. I don't know if there's anyone else here who loves a scary movie or a scary video game, who loves riding on roller coasters. Nope. In fact, HSPs usually avoid those things, so, I'm a bit of an anomaly there. But there's also, people who chase pain, who love the feeling of getting up on a tattoo bed or eating really spicy food, or love having a cry when you can sit down to watch a really sad movie or read a really sad book. So our emotions, our relationship with our emotions are complicated, but something else that has a huge impact on the way that we feel and experience our emotions is the stories that we tell ourselves about them and the meaning that we give them in the moment. And you see, this was what was really holding me back. When I thought that I could be this great artist, when I wanted to create and put my work out there, I would feel that sense of sinking in my stomach. I would feel myself tense up, and I would hear that chatter in my head telling me, this isn't good enough and you're not a good enough artist. You see, I could have noticed those physical sensations inside, and instead, a new story could have been, okay, well, you might be a little disappointed that this work isn't exactly what you wanted, but perhaps that just means that you have high standards and it's time to keep developing your skills, keep developing your competence. And is there anyone that you can invite in to give you some more guidance and support? So you see, the feelings are the same either way, and yet the stories that we tell ourselves about our feelings are critical in allowing us to thrive and prosper alongside them. So another thing that I needed to dig a little deeper was this idea of knowing who I was and who I could be when I couldn't be a singer anymore, when I couldn't be a performer. You see, when I was in music, I was going out there singing other people's songs, but I had big dreams and I thought that I'd go on to write my own cabaret shows and perform in a range of bands and release my own music. So all those dreams completely shattered the day that I finished that gig, and I kind of knew that it was all over. In fact, what I ended up learning was that I'd experienced a subtle vocal rupture in the months prior to that gig. And because of my relationship with my own feelings and emotions, I didn't want to confront that something was wrong. I kept trying to sing over it, and sing over it I did for months and months and gigs and days and days, until finally my voice completely gave out. However, even though it felt like that tragedy was localized to my vocal cords, the real drama was playing out inside my head and inside my body. So without my voice, who was I and who could I be? I needed to get to know myself a little bit better, and I knew that I couldn't reach for any of those goals that I wanted before. But what I was learning in all the psych books that I was reading was that the goals that I was setting myself anyway were kind of setting me up for disaster. Because everything that I'd pinned my hopes on, everything that I wanted to achieve in this world was something that was outside of myself. I wanted to get this many followers online, and I wanted to get on these festival lineups and release albums that went to #1. All these things that I could have worked towards, but I could have never guaranteed. And so without ever having achieved them, I could have then gone, well, you're not good enough. And there you go, another reason to be disappointed. One thing that the psych literature talks about is that when we set goals, what we need to do is really focus on goals that we can live out within ourselves, that can't be taken away, that offer us a direction and a guide as to how we want to show up in the world and live our life. And I kind of like this idea. So I landed on these 3: creativity, challenge, and curiosity. First up, creativity was a little bit contentious for me. I thought that maybe my creative self died the day that my voice did. However, I realized that creativity is not something that can ever be taken away. Creativity is a mindset, it's an approach to life, it's a way that we can live, and it's a way that we can learn to express ourselves. So when I started to feel a little bit braver and bolder, I gave myself permission to play around creatively. I started painting, I started doing design, and I started approaching life in a more creative way than I had ever done before. And this time I started doing it and sharing it. I started writing things and sharing them. And it was scary. And those feelings never went away. However, I didn't let them tell the story of who I was going to be and what I wanted to do. So next up was challenge. And despite the fact that I used to get up on a weekly basis and sing songs to an entire crowd of people, that was something I'd been doing for so long. It was almost firmly wedged in my comfort zone. I realized that I didn't ever give myself much of an opportunity to be challenged, to move beyond my comfort zone, because I hated that feeling. I hated that feeling that sunk in my stomach, that was a sign that I was doing something wrong and that I should just stay in my lane. So instead, I decided to challenge myself in arenas that I was notoriously crap at. I was the girl who used to have a sick day every time there was cross country on at high school. There was literally no way that you could get me into a gym, and I remember when I met my husband, I made fun of him for owning a pair of sneakers. That is how exercise averse I was. I decided to push it to the absolute limit and learn how to pole dance. It took a while and I felt like an absolute hack, but it turned out to be really fun. And it was a place where I could also enjoy music without the pressure of having to be this this great performer. And so finally, curiosity. And I think this has been the most powerful one for me, because curiosity is a type of approach that I would never usually have brought to the ideas and the relationships and the experiences I wanted in my life. In fact, the kind of energy I would bring was often criticism and judgment. I would be very quick to go, this is right and that is wrong. That looks good and that looks bad. And that kind of energy became really quite destructive for me. And what I came to learn, again, reading the psychology books, was the fact that we can actually visit things with a sense of openness and curiosity instead of rushing to judgment, instead of rushing to critique. And this is what I started to do. I learned first how to do it with my internal world. And this came from me forcing myself to very uncomfortably sit down and close my eyes and do nothing for 5 minutes. It sounds easy. It's actually really hard. And every time something comes up, a feeling, a thought, a sensation, you're so pulled by it. And I was often pulled to say, this is me meditating really wrong. You're so shit at meditating. Oh, what's that feeling? Oh, you're feeling anxiety. Oh God, this is going to be a really bad day. Oh, like you shouldn't have drunk that coffee. Rah, rah, rah. This whole internal monologue goes on and on. And you know what? The monologue hasn't really stopped. I'm sorry, I have been trying to do this meditation thing for 6 years. But what has shifted for me is that I try to meet these experiences with a sense of curiosity. So I meet that anxious, wobbly tummy feeling. And I meet those critical voices in my head and I go, interesting. Instead of letting them, giving them the keys to the car and driving it for me. So I've become a lot better and a lot more curious, I guess, not only at what's going on in my internal world, but also the experiences that I'm having with other people. I give others more benefit of the doubt now. I don't rush to judgment when someone, doesn't talk to me at a party or a friend hasn't texted me back. I'm open to curiosity and it's given me so much more opportunity to do cool and brave things. So the next thing is, now that I was getting to know myself a little bit better, I wanted to know what it was that I could do that would allow me to live a curious, a creative, and a connected life. And when I was a teenager, I thought that a life of being this avant-garde artist was amazing. I wrote off, potentially ever at finding a partner. I didn't want anyone to tie me down. I thought people who grew up and had families were mega boring. And so this was really something that I'd held onto for a really long time. Again, in reading book after book after book, I was finding all of these psychological studies that spoke about the power of connections and how our sense of belonging and connectedness is so essential for our life satisfaction and our sense of well-being. And now that I'd kind of gotten on board with the idea that, being happy and satisfied in life, that doesn't sound too bad, right? So I decided to invest a little bit more in things outside of myself. I'd lived so inwardly focused for so long. It was all about me. It was all about my drama. It was all about what I could do. So I decided to invest a little bit more in my friendships. These are my teenage friends, so they grew up with the insufferable me, all for 6 years, so RIP to them. And I invested more in being a better partner. My husband is actually a professional musician, so we used to play gigs together. And I remember when I couldn't play gigs anymore, I was like, is he going to run out the door? But fortunately he didn't. It was nice that he stuck around. Another thing that I wanted to invest myself in more was my love of learning. Discovering this psych section in the bookstore really inspired me. And in fact, my husband goes, "You're reading so much about psychology. Why don't you just go to uni and study it?" So I was like, okay. And I did my grad dip in psychology, and I'm currently now enrolled at the University of Sydney doing a PhD in cytopsychology too. So I'm allowing that love of learning to really thrive. And finally, I decided that I was going to also invest in becoming a mum and wanting to show up for my kid and for the people that I love in my life in new and rich ways. And I found that these things really gave me meaning. It became incredibly empowering to discover that you don't need to place meaning in one avenue of your life. And I recognized that that's exactly what I was doing. Everything was about me being a singer. Everything was about this idea of me being a tortured artist. And what can be incredibly important and useful is that you can find meaning in a lot of parts of yourself, in a lots of avenues of who you are. Because none of us are only one thing. We are so rich and multifaceted and complex. So we should allow different parts of us to thrive. And it creates such a bedrock of well-being and satisfaction because we know that our happiness and well-being and success is not pinned to one thing and one thing alone. If I had known that back in my music days, it would have alleviated a lot of pain and suffering, but perhaps without that pain and suffering, I would have never have been forced to find some new avenues to walk down and new ways to experience and live my life. Because I really discovered that, and this is through the research that I'm currently doing at UCID, where I'm studying social media, identity and authenticity, that we can't really find a true self or our real authentic self. What we can do though is become a self, or we can become a range of selves that can make us proud, that feel meaningful to us, and that can contribute to the world around us in beautiful, impactful, and powerful ways. So I really want to leave you with a few of these deep takeaways that when it comes to deep feeling, we define our feelings. They don't define us. Deep knowing. We get to know ourselves more deeply through creativity, challenge, and curiosity. And deep being. We give greater depth to our lives when we live with a sense of purpose and take ownership of our stories. And taking ownership of my story and sharing it here for you guys today has been really beautiful, profound, and made a huge difference to me. So I hope there was something that you connected with. Cheers. Yes, so I actually spent some time thinking about what I wanted for the mental health industry. There's so much amazing and incredible stuff going on. And my full-time gig is actually working as an in-house psychologist at Support Act. And Support Act is the Australian music industry's charity. Tomorrow is actually Oz Music T-shirt Day. So if you want to get behind it, make sure you rock your Aussie music T-shirts tomorrow and you can donate to Support Act. So that sort of landed me in a really great place. And what I discovered was that sometimes creative people need more creative approaches to mental health and well-being and different types of conversations and not kind of the same boring, dry information being repeated over and over. Some of my first clients that I saw as a therapist all sort of worked in creative spaces and they were experiencing their own unique challenges. So heavy mental is very much in its early days. But what I would love to grow it into is a space for resources and services and support for people working in creative industries, not only dealing maybe with mental health challenges, but also dealing with, creative challenges to reckon with their own creativity and how to live as an artist, how to take risks, things to do with, courage and curiosity and challenge too. So yeah, that's what I hope I can do with it. But you can follow me on Instagram, and that's kind of where I'm, fiddling about with a lot of these ideas.
And Ash, tell us what you did yesterday.
Oh yes, so I have just launched a one-day creative intensive workshop with Support Act. We launched it in Adelaide earlier this week, and it was so scary. I'd never run a whole workshop. I was like, they're going to be sick of me by the end of 7 hours. But quite honestly, the room was full of producers and musicians, but also people working in music admin and ticketing, and people who I guess self-identified as creative people. And we spent the day playing games, telling stories, sharing, doing activities, and it was really just bloody heartwarming and really nice to share some of the learnings that I discovered on my path to finding a new sense of meaning for me and sharing that with people in a creative way. So that's called Creative Minds, and at the moment it only exists within Support Act for the music industry, but if that sounds cool to you, you can hit me up and I can see what I can put together.
T, do you have a question?
I do.
Go for it.
It's a question. Your friends at the start, like I think I got 8 out of 8, and I was wondering how well everyone did on the recognising the dead and the dead dying young. The goose.
Ash, can you repeat the question in the mic?
Yes, so the question was, how did we go with the tortured artist bingo? Yes?
Well, no, the question was like, especially with your research that you're doing, like what's Gen Z's version of that Bruce? Because that must be a very old. That's all like 60s. I mean, apart from Amy.
Yes. No, this is true. I guess there's.
Who are they?
There's like, well, you're putting me on the spot.
No, I was actually suggesting maybe they might like.
Yeah, if other people know, I think Mac Miller passed away of a drug overdose. There's some people, I guess, like residual tragic victims of music in the.
It's kind of like, has career become a trope? Like, does no one need to do that anymore because it's now like done? Like, I'm really interested in that relationship because it doesn't feel like it's a thing.
That is very fascinating. You have like Gen Zers in the house. We definitely have some Gen Zers here. Like, can you put your hands up if you feel like the tortured artist trope still endures? Yeah? Kind of?
I'm not a Gen Z, but I know that it does, and it happens, I think, a lot, and not to define different categories of music, but I think in the rap industry, I think with the younger, it does happen a lot.
Oh, I think it can be quite genre specific. And yeah, like, look, this is just like a little bit more of insight into me. I decided that I was going to like drift into the 1960s and 70s and never leave.
That's interesting as well. I mean, I was thinking about the artists who died in like the 1920s, like, which is probably where that's how old I am.
So you're not from the 90s.
like if I was going to put together my the Good Die Young group, they would be from earlier in the century.
Mm-hmm.
Although I'm down with these guys, and
Yeah.
like rap artists really, are struggling.
They've been there for like 20, I think 19, they've been quite young.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Cool. Yeah, but great question. So yeah, well, for those at the back, we're talking about like who are today's kind of artists in this realm, and I guess T posed the question of does that still need to happen today, which is interesting. I mean, maybe not.
No, I just had to say that art students study art history and think Vincent van Gogh. And I think that when you're young, you kind of aspire, what you talked about, you aspire to be the greatest. You want to make, not a dent, but you want to be remembered for a very long period of time. So you think of people who were in history, and you see those people, you see Vincent van Gogh, and I think it's very relevant. Because you think, oh, those guys were remembered. You don't look what's happening now, you look at the past. So
Yeah.
this is like 60s or whatever it is. It's still very relevant, I think.
I definitely still see it working within the music industry and in terms of the mental health struggles that people experience there. Like, obviously, the music industry as a whole has its challenges, but there is still a lot of these enduring myths that you need to kind of be messed up to make good music, you need to be on drugs or drunk when you're performing it or writing it. And, a lot of those myths are all entangled with this idea that to be great at what you do, you need to be damaged, you need to be suffering, you need to be in pain. Yeah, I think that that's something that really does hold people back from being able to live these like rich and meaningful and satisfied lives if they think that they have to keep themselves hurting for the sake of their art. So let's put that one in the bin.
Guys, we've got time for one more question. Has anyone? Jacqueline.
Yeah, so I was wondering, do you have any suggestions for frameworks to follow for individuals for us to like reflect on our own feelings, reframe it, and interpret it in a different way? And how often do you do that?
Yes, that's a great question.
It's
like
the question.
So the question was if I had any suggestions for like frameworks or practices for like interpreting your feelings or reflecting on the thoughts that are showing up and how you might bring a more sort of curious eye, I'd say, to it. Yeah, look, there's lots of different ways, and this is something that you'd probably go into with a therapist because there are some techniques that work better or worse depending on what your vibe is and what you connect with. Like therapies such as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, things like ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. They all offer sort of their own types of routes to exploring this. There's also sort of narrative therapy, which helps you understand the stories of your life and how they all tie together. For me personally, I found CBT to be incredibly like a huge shift in the way that I saw myself in the world, because you start to realize, oh, these thoughts are just thoughts, and in fact I can challenge them. In fact, if someone else was standing there and yelling my thoughts at me, I'd be a lot more discerning. I'd be a lot more like, hey, that doesn't sound like that is true, or that's a horrible thing to say. And yet when they're lurking inside your head, right, it's a lot harder to create that space. So sort of a CBT program kind of takes you into the I can't go into it all here, obviously, but there's a lot of sort of free CBT services and workbooks and things that you can do on your own.
Guys, that's all we have time for. give Ash another huge round of